Good afternoon and welcome to our event, Vaccines for the Caribbean, Why It Matters for the United States. Today's discussion is a critical one. For more than a year, Latin America and the Caribbean have suffered from the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Caribbean, in particular, has fared worse than most. Their small size and open economies are dependent on the international system, which means that when a global pandemic halts trade, travel, and foreign investment, these countries are some of the most affected. For example, 10 of the 14 independent CARICOM nations rank in the top 20 of tourism dependent states in the world, and those that are not reliant on tourism instead depend on international markets to export natural resources. The result was an almost 13% GDP decline across the region in 2020, excluding Guyana. This is why, when vaccines started to come online, we at the Caribbean Initiative knew that the region must be among the first in line. To aid the Caribbean in its own efforts, we set out to launch a broader campaign to show why the Caribbean should be prioritized. This culminated in a private roundtable that consisted of members of the US and Caribbean governments, regional organizations, and the private sector. I thank all the participants whose insights helped us craft the Caribbean Initiative's first issue brief on the strategic importance of sending US vaccines to the Caribbean. Today's marks its official launch. In the brief, our co-authors, Ambassador James Brewster and Wasim Mola, highlight the domestic and geopolitical importance for the United States to send vaccines to the Caribbean on balance with the rest of the Western Hemisphere. This argument and the stress we place on it is based on years of close US-Caribbean ties, partnership, and friendship. When we hosted Prime Minister Keith Rowley in his capacity as a CARICOM chair, he spoke of resetting US-Caribbean relations with vaccine donations as a critical component. Well, we have heard his and the Caribbean's call. But today, and in our brief, we go a step further, and we suggest that to help the Caribbean is to actually help the United States. President Biden's administration's recent announcement that a further 14 million vaccines will be donated bilaterally to Latin America and the Caribbean is a welcome sign. Supporting the region with a substantial bilateral donation that allows them to reopen economies and accelerate recovery, which has benefits for the US economy and its geopolitical interests, as a healthy Caribbean economy is vital to Florida's. And as US vaccine donations have been limited, other actors such as China and Russia have provided support to the region, ushering in a new age of geopolitical discussion. So, as we move through today's discussion, we must remember that to continue strengthening the US-Caribbean partnership across all sectors and industries, vaccine donations and broader pandemic recovery support is needed. This month is also National Caribbean American Heritage Month, and at the Caribbean Initiative, we wanted to fully support this by ending June with a substantive session which highlights the most pressing priority for the region to ensure future economic well-being and prosperity for the hemisphere. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jason Marzak, the director of the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center.
Thank you so much, Melanie, both for your comments, but also for all of your work to make the Caribbean Initiative possible and to have launched it this year. Again, happy Caribbean American Heritage Month. Today's event is part of our broader embrace of what this month represents, which is to acknowledge that Caribbean Americans represent the benefits of strong US-Caribbean relationships. As Melanie mentioned, today's event also marks the public launch of our initiative's first publication, which for those joining us via Zoom, we will place the link in the chat as that publication was just made public prior to today's discussion. Its release is all the more timely following the Biden administration's announcement last week of additional vaccines for Latin America and the Caribbean, and within that context, Caribbean community members. As more and more vaccines become available for global shipments, at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center, we have been front and center in putting forward the health, economic, and strategic importance of those vaccines going to our own hemisphere. And within our Caribbean initiative, to Caribbean countries, where significant vaccines to CARICOM could have a huge impact given countries' small populations. But as we say in today's issue brief, vaccines are a critical step, but so is how they are delivered, the medical equipment that must go along with the vaccines as well. And additional US assistance is fundamental as we continue to see a ramp up in other actors' engagement with the region, notably China, at the vaccine and diplomatic levels. Bottom line is that helping the Caribbean is in the best interest of the United States. The key economic linkages shared between the US and the Caribbean economies is also vital for our own recovery, especially for South Florida, whose tourism industry is at its best with open Caribbean economies. So we have a great lineup of speakers today to discuss these topics and to shed additional light on the domestic and the geopolitical importance of sending US vaccines to the Caribbean. We're joined by Ambassador Anton Edmonds. Ambassador Edmonds is St. Lucia's ambassador to the United States and Mexico, as well as the permanent representative to the OAS and High Commissioner to Canada. Ambassador Edmonds' years of experience in both the Caribbean and Washington puts him in a very unique position to speak on today's topic. Ambassador Edmonds, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We also have with us Ambassador Wally Brewster, who is also the co-author of our issue brief. Ambassador Brewster was the former U.S. ambassador to the Dominican Republic. He also serves as a member of our Caribbean Initiative's U.S. Caribbean Consultative Group. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. James Fitzgerald. Dr. Fitzgerald, the Director of Health Systems and Services at PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, whose vast experience in health systems and governance have proved critical before and, of course, during the pandemic. With that, we're going to turn to our speakers. I also want to encourage everybody who's watching to tweet using the hashtag ACCaribbean. I'll try to get to your questions as well. So those joining via the Zoom feature, please feel free to enter your questions using the Q&A function. We're going to start off by, I want to set the scene to beginning and then talk a little bit about the Caribbean's strategic importance to the United States, the issue of geopolitical competition and vaccine diplomacy, and then look moving forward as well. Ambassador Edmonds, I'd like to start off with you. All countries have suffered the effects of the pandemic. There has been a disproportionate impact on the Caribbean. I'd like to begin asking you, how have these countries, including, of course, your own, St. Lucia, fared, and also which sectors have been most impacted? And what impact is this having on the Caribbean's economic growth prospects?
Jason, thanks a lot for the invitation. Very grateful for the Atlantic Council taking this issue on. Fundamentally, the impact on the Caribbean has been significant. For countries like mine, dependent on tourism for about 60-70% of employment, direct and indirect, having the industry, in essence, shut down has been crippling to us. We've seen basically contraction in St. Lucia at about 18%, in the wider Caribbean between 8 and 20%. Ultimately, travel numbers have been down 70%. And really and truly what tourism is, at least for my country, is a major source of foreign exchange. So our ability to pay our bills as a country has been cramped somewhat. And one of the significant elements of the pandemic has been the investment that we've had to make in a health system, not only in St. Lucia, but in the wider region, that we all of a sudden were faced with the fact was not as robust as we thought it should be or it could be. It's allowed us, or it's forced us to take money away from resilience planning. We're smack dab in the beginning of a hurricane season, so we're all very leery and weary as to what could happen for our economies where we haven't been able to generate that income to address the resilience issues that we should be preparing for. So loss of jobs, reorientation of revenue to schools or schooling, which is now online, and the standing up of healthcare facilities has been sort of a horrendous byproduct of the slowdown of our economies in the region.
Thanks so much, Ambassador. I want to pick up on a little bit your point on the loss of jobs and what also that means both for St. Lucia and for other countries in the Caribbean, but also what it means for Florida, what it means for South Florida in particular. Dr. Fitzgerald, Ambassador Edmonds mentioned health systems and the impact that that COVID is placing the stresses placing on health systems, and he also makes a very important point of hurricane season and being prepared for that. Our issue brief highlights that emerging variants of the virus, and you and I have spoken about this as well, Dr. Fitzgerald, they're causing rising infections. They're also causing lockdowns in some Caribbean states. What are you seeing as some of the implications as it relates of COVID, as it relates to health systems in the Caribbean, and also the capacity to manage new variants across the Caribbean?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Great to be able to join you again today. With the emergence of this new variant, I think what we're particularly concerned about is that health systems are already stressed. And as this variant will move through the region, given the increased levels of infection and ultimately the impact it will have in particular in hospitalizations, countries will be further stressed. Countries have done a lot of work in ensuring adaptability and the reorganization of health services, and in particular, increasing ICU capacity throughout the region. But we have to remember within the Caribbean, there's a particular context and there is a limiting factor. And that limiting factor is essentially the health workforce. We're essentially in a context of small island developing nations with a limited health workforce. We have been engaged in extensive training, in particular in ICU specialized nurses, but there is ultimately a rate limiter in terms of expansion, and that is the availability of nurses and qualified medics that can be actually working within the healthcare system. And so that is particularly what we're concerned about at this point in time.
Thank you so much. I want to turn to you, Ambassador Brewster, before digging a little bit deeper on some of these topics, as well as some of the many arguments and conclusions put forward in today's issue brief that we're launching. But Ambassador Brewster, the White House has announced a series of global vaccine announcements over the last month. 6 million for Latin American Caribbean countries, including CARICOM on June 3rd, followed by announcements a week later of 500 million vaccines for global distribution, of which 5 Caribbean countries and 9 in Latin America and the Caribbean overall qualify among the 92 country recipients. And then the additional 14 million vaccines for the region, including CARICOM through COVAX, announced last week, as well as CARICOM countries qualifying for some additional numbers of 14 million more vaccines targeted at regional priorities. So a series of announcements that we've had over the course of the last month that impacts the region writ large and CARICOM specifically. So I want to go back to, as you're having served as ambassador in the region, how do you see these announcements being perceived by Caribbean governments, and what are some of the implications of these announcements?
Well, first of all, thanks to the Atlantic Council and really focusing on this key issue that is of great concern for everybody. Jason, to your question, I think the perception is that it is something that has been waited for a long time. I think, the leaders of the Caribbean nations are just as President Biden is doing, trying to save the lives of their people and to provide opportunities for vaccines to be available in their countries. So I do think that it came with kind of a relief in the beginning, but now it's, when is it going to be delivered? And I think that is the most important concept that we have to realize, is that as we saw deaths increasing in the US, we know how we felt. Well, the deaths are increasing on a rapid rising pace in the Caribbean. And so there is pressure not only on the political leaders, but also on societies just to get access to the vaccines, which are the main vaccines that are produced in the United States. So now I think the question is, by these countries, when are we actually going to get the vaccines? And I think we have to break down as much bureaucracy and streamline the process so that we can quickly get the vaccines there. It was very positive news, and I'm very proud of the administration to announce the support. But I think, one, we need to increase that, and two, we have to allow access to countries to be able to get their orders quickly filled. And as we mentioned as well, countries aren't asking specifically to be given vaccines. They're willing to pay for them. They just want to be able to have access to the major vaccine manufacturers and get delivery as soon as possible. because we're talking small nations, and they don't have the lobbying power or the buying power as other nations around the world might have. But as a consolidated group, they are critical for our national security, for our citizen security, for our health security, and for so many other reasons that the previous speaker spoke about.
And you make a lot of those points with Wasim in the issue brief. We'll get into those: the geopolitical importance, the economic importance, the health importance. I'd like to actually, Ambassador Edmonds or Dr. Fitzgerald, if either of you would like to comment on some of the points Ambassador Brewster just made, specifically, I think the point of how to receive those vaccines. I think it's an incredibly important point that we're not talking about just donations, right? We're talking about receiving vaccines in a number of different ways, and many countries are ready to pay for those vaccines. It's just a matter of being prioritized from pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Fitzgerald, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. You know, I mean, the Caribbean has made an enormous effort in securing vaccines, available vaccines, with two exceptions. The Caribbean initiated vaccination campaigns back in March, essentially using bilateral donations from governments, from friendly governments, and with some initial deliveries from COVAX. But, you know, the concern is essentially at this point in time, a total of 1.8 million doses have been administered now across the vast majority of the non-Latin Caribbean countries and territories. But of these, we're only at around 30% of complete vaccination schedules. And of course, that varies depending on whether it's a 1 or 2 dose scheme. So what we're really trying to focus on now is reinforcing access to vaccines, working with the US government, as is highlighted in the policy brief, but also working with the CARICOM economic integration, political and economic integration mechanism at the Caribbean level, and also CARFA, which is the specialized public health agency within the region. And so by bringing these parties together, we feel that we can facilitate a rapid increase in available vaccines through donation of the US government. The other factor I think that we have to look at, which is also very much highlighted in the brief, is the issue of the pool procurement. As you know, we have the revolving fund mechanism. We have completed our forecasting for 2022. And we want to thank all those countries that have completed that. There are some countries that have yet to complete that. And so that kind of provides us with a vision for the future. But the urgency is now. We would need to move quickly now.
Yeah, and I see everybody nodding their heads in agreement as you're speaking. And I think as Ambassador Bruce said, incredibly important, these announcements. And now it's the speed. It's about getting jabs in arms as quick as possible. Ambassador Bruce, what in the issue brief that we released today, you and Wasim Molla highlighted the strategic role of the Caribbean for the United States. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to provide a brief overview of some of the arguments and specifically what both of you saw insofar as why sending vaccines to the Caribbean is beneficial for the United States. And I'd also want to, as Melanie mentioned at the beginning, thank the many folks who came together with the Caribbean Initiative last month, about 20 folks for a strategy session to help to inform this issue brief. But please go ahead. I'd love to give you an opportunity to highlight some of those initial main arguments to begin with.
Sure. I think, you know, one of the things we're seeing are the variances that are happening right now. And if you look at the amount of tourists that are going back and forth, as an Ambassador Edmonds had mentioned, but also as was mentioned in Melanie's opening, going back and forth, the planes are full now, going back and forth to the countries. And so the idea of variance is when we have populations that aren't fully vaccinated or don't have access to vaccines, the opportunity for variances in those countries to be created is going to be greater. Or because they do come, tourists come from all over the world, the opportunity for American tourists to get any type of variances from others is going to impact the health security of the United States. And so we're going to continue to have those challenges. On the economic perspective, you know, the 6th largest trading partner of the United States, when you look at the Caribbean overall, as was mentioned, it has, Ambassador Evans mentioned, it has significantly impacted trade where the US companies are well represented there. And then when you look at it also, you know, from the aspects of just impacting the economies. The economies are being devastated because of the people not being able to work, hotels not being able to be opened, not being able to be fully, a functioning economy in these countries, which are dependent on everybody being able to. And so what that does is create more exposure for the United States in the long term to have to support a lot of the things that are going to need to happen to really help with some of the impoverished areas of these countries who are the ones that are struggling the most. Because the amount of Americans that live in the Caribbean and that live back and forth between the two nations, the wealthy have a tendency to be able to come to the US and get vaccinated. And that's the largest population in these countries of those who are vaccinated. It's those that don't have those means that are the ones that are struggling and are the ones that are putting the stress on the hospitals. Not deaths will go up, but debt will go up as well for these countries, which will have long-term impact. And the last, Jason, is the geopolitical issues. We're not perceived right now as the best friend of the Caribbean as we should be and have been in the past. China stepped up, and even though they didn't give as many vaccines as was needed, they did step up and give it. And that was rewarded by people looking at them more favorably than maybe we would like for that to be. And I think they continue to do that. So it's imperative that we begin to get out there and show that we're the true partners that we really are.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ambassador Brewster. Incredibly important comments. I want to get more into the geopolitical implications. We're starting to get some questions over the Q&A function. I'll bring those into the discussion. Please feel free to continue to add those in there. But I want to move to you, Ambassador Edmonds. Actually, we were talking right before this about St. Lucia receiving its first cruise ship this coming week. And I'd like to bring it to you to talk a little bit about the Caribbean's importance to the U.S. economy as well, including Florida. And Ambassador Brewster has mentioned that we make a point in the issue brief that the Caribbean represents more than a third of total trade with Florida. And of course, the South Florida economy is also very much, so many small and medium-sized businesses are so dependent upon the cruise industry and others, as are, of course, small, medium-sized businesses in St. Lucia and other countries across the Caribbean. I'd like to give you an opportunity to explain how else is the Caribbean also beneficial to Florida, the U.S. economy, including the tourism industry overall.
Thanks, Jason. Look, in broad strokes, the fact is that we also travel. I mean, we tend to focus on travel into the Caribbean, but folks from the Caribbean also travel to the United States. And for most of us, quite frankly, Florida is the hub to everywhere else in the world we go. So there's an economic relationship, a tourism tie that we should not downplay. If one is to believe, which I do, that about 75 cents on every dollar that a tourist spends in the Caribbean comes back to the United States, that indicates the significance of the monetary relationship or the trading relationship. Obviously, there's a banking relationship with banks that are hubbed in Florida that do business in the wider region. So that applies as well. The relationship between Florida, it's been interesting because we really and truly focus on sort of the national or the federal government and that relationship as it relates to the Caribbean. I dare say that maybe one of the things coming out of this is the need for a better recognition and stronger ties between Florida and the Caribbean itself. Policy delivery as well as policy formation could be helpful so that we can all work on that loop that exists between Florida and the Caribbean in terms of tourists going back and forth, be it on the cruise industry or be it through the airlines. I think that on the economic front, the one thing that we did not really touch on, or we have not touched on as yet, is the issue of remittances. For a lot of countries in the Caribbean, remittances has continued to sort of be a little bit of a stabilizing factor. But the reality, obviously, is that the impact of COVID in the United States has also impacted the ability of many people to send remittances back home. So the instability, there's a trade and economic strong relationship that has traditionally existed, which is being damaged. And the relationships amongst people in terms of people moving back and forth or sending money back and forth has been diminished a little bit. I want to touch I use the word the social aspect of things, but the impact of of the economic slowdown and the lack of access to vaccines and everything else has also allowed us to start to see a lot more social problems within the region. Unemployment or underemployment, we're starting to see the rise in crime and criminal elements. So the cost benefit analysis in terms of what does it cost to deploy solutions into the region today versus having to deal with a generational problem is something that we also need to take into consideration as it relates to this sort of vaccine diplomacy discussion that we're currently having. But you speak to the shipping lines, US shipping lines, obviously airlines are starting to pick up a little bit. Everybody has felt the economic sort of repercussions of this. And it's going to take time. We spoke prior to, for small businesses, the informal sector that we depend on, the mom and pop shops who deal with tourists beyond the hotels, even those who provide agriculture into the hotel facilities. It's going to take time for them to ramp back up. So this is going to be a long, hard slog for us in the Caribbean in terms of recovery. And obviously it does impact what our spend capacity is in states like Florida.
You know, Ambassador Edmonds, you make a number of really good points, and I see Ambassador Brewster nodding his head in agreement. One of the points for those who haven't yet read the issue brief that was just released is also looking at the security implications for a lack of vaccination. That when aspects of the economy are not able to move forward, other elements come and fill that gap. And I think you make a really important point about focusing now on the short term versus the long term implications of lack of vaccines, which means a lack of an ability to fully re-accelerate the economies quickly. Dr. Fitzgerald, I want to turn to you. There was Ambassador Brewster mentioned about variants and health implications for the United States, and I'd like to get your thoughts on the potential risk to the U.S. population if there are not if the virus continues to emerge in the Caribbean, and maybe also, Dr. Fitz, bringing a question here from the audience. One of the questions, which I think is, of course, appropriate for you, is a question of: is it safe for vaccinated Americans to travel to the Caribbean, given the lower vaccination rates that many countries have?
So yeah, thanks for that. First, dealing with the variance issues, you know, as we've seen in terms of the deployment of vaccines within the United States, it's advancing well, even if vaccination rates appear to be slowing somewhat. And we do also see certain pockets where vaccination rates are significantly lower than in other areas, which obviously has implications in terms of the potential spread of the Delta variant in particular. And so these are areas of particular concern also, I think, for anyone, including Caribbeans traveling to the United States, and also for citizens from the United States traveling into the Caribbean to facilitate further transmission of the variants. In terms of the travel, the recommendations, I think, are quite clear on this. Every country will have their recommendations published. I think the US government also has extensive information available through CDC on requirements for traveling. But in terms of, obviously, we urge everyone to get vaccination, make sure that they are vaccinated when they are traveling, and to provide the necessary evidence of vaccination. And for those that cannot, to essentially implement the necessary public health measures that are required to protect them. If they are not vaccinated, we would essentially urge them not to travel if at all possible. And so this really highlights the importance of ensuring greater equity and access to vaccines globally, not just within the context of the Caribbean and the United States, but to ensure that as we kind of reopen our economies and mobility increases, that equity in access to vaccines will ensure greater protections for everyone.
Thank you. And an additional question for you from the audience before moving on to geopolitics. There's two different questions maybe I'll turn to you, Dr. Fitzgerald, and then others feel free to please jump in here. But there's a question about from someone from Trinidad of when realistically there could be shipments of some of the donations, as well as a question on what could be the potential role for NGOs or humanitarian aid ships such as the Comfort to be able to deliver vaccines.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have exact dates yet in terms of the availability of the donations. We're working very hard on that jointly with our partners in CARICOM and in CARF. And as soon as we have information, we'll make that information available. On the issue of the shipments, I think the logistics aspects are not the real issue at the moment. I think there is considerable experience, including through the PAHO revolving fund, of providing vaccines into these countries. So I would kind of argue that the logistical aspects is not a major priority. Of course, the participation of NGOs and all partners to really expand and support vaccination activities is important, but the countries have considerable experience in the deployment of the vaccines once they have it. We are concerned, I think, Jason, one point here, in the area of vaccine hesitancy, which we do see will be and is becoming an issue, a potential issue of concern within the Caribbean. Just for your information, we carried out a survey in 14 countries during the period of April and May, and we found that of 1,200 healthcare workers surveyed, 23% of them reported significant vaccine hesitancy when it comes to COVID-19. So that may be an issue. But I don't think the logistics in terms of the shipments of vaccines will be an issue once they become available.
Thank you. And you also answered a question about hesitancy that was in the chat. Ambassador Edmonds, would you like to also jump on the question of hesitancy before moving on to geopolitics?
If I may, thank you. I think the biggest issue, that's a huge issue. And I think, unfortunately, the reason for it, whether we could have had more vaccines prior, would have allowed us to sort of cross that bridge is some speculation, but that may very well go to the issue of NGOs and others within the community being more actively involved in really and truly getting people over the hump as it relates to the hesitancy issue. But it is a growing problem, and it is a significant problem, and obviously it's a concern, I think, for all countries in the region.
Thank you so much. I want to move to in the next 10 minutes look at geopolitical competition and vaccine diplomacy, then end with like next steps moving forward. Ambassador Brewster, turning to geopolitics, medical diplomacy has been at the forefront of geopolitical competition in Latin America and the Caribbean. The issue brief notes that since the onset of the pandemic, in addition to the US, Caribbean countries have received medical supplies or vaccines from China, Russia, India, African Union, Cuba, most recently Mexico. Often donations have also become part of a broader package that includes loans and investment commitments. Can you help us understand some of the implications, the really important implications for US foreign policy as it relates to Caribbean engagement with some of these countries, given the uptick in vaccine diplomacy from others around the world, most specifically the doubling down, at least in commitments put forward from China?
Sure. It's interesting. A lot of times it's not very complicated. It comes down to being very simple when you're under stress, as a lot of leaders are, and it's what have you done for me lately? Because that's what their people are looking at, and it comes down to the vaccine. The United States still, I think, is amazing at medical diplomacy when it comes to working with the international organizations like PAHO and others, and also the amount of equipment and PPE and others that have been donated. And they continue to do that throughout the nations, but it comes down to the vaccine. And I think that China was very adept in quickly using it as an opportunity. And as I tried to explain to many of the leaders in other nations, that any president's objective is to get their own people vaccinated And that's why President Biden came in and needed to do the things he needed to do immediately to get the US population vaccinated, and then as quickly as possible goes out there. But it's critical because what will happen is this is a long-term effect. Young people that are living in these nations that are seeing family members die will remember this time when they become leaders of nations. And the thing about diplomacy is it's something that takes on generations to build, and you don't want to break it down because of one opportunity that we may miss. And so I do think that the Biden administration has stepped up, but it also creates a challenge for us long term, because there are those bad actors that are having the opportunity, as Ambassador Edmonds mentioned, to begin to expand their foothold in the region while we're still figuring out how to deliver vaccines. And I think it's critical that as we're taking back the forward look of being the leader in diplomacy around the world and democracy, this is a huge opportunity. And I think the Biden administration is stepping up. I think we just need to move as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much. On that point as well, Ambassador Edmonds, we know that the Biden administration is committed to working within multilateral frameworks in order to be successful. Our issue brief also argues that the importance of the 14 votes in CARICOM, incredibly influential both in the Organization of American States and the UN and other forums. How might the perceptions that Ambassador Brewster spoke about, how could that potentially affect CARICOM member votes at regional and also international organizations?
Well, look, I think it would be it's maybe too simplistic to look at it solely through the prism of the vaccines. I think the issue that we have is one where the region oftentimes thinks that it's an afterthought, that we're stable, we're not problems. So at the end of the day, nobody really takes us seriously until all of a sudden there's a conflagration in the space. I think what happened with COVID is countries in the region basically realized that they had friends and allies or interested parties globally. So that's that happened. Now a lot of these relationships, like in the case of St. Lucia, we got a lot of support from Taiwan. Taiwan has been a long-standing partner of St. Lucia. We've gotten support from Mexico, obviously a deep relationship. There's even been support from Cuba for the wider region. Once again, a deep relationship. So I think the way we probably have to very carefully frame this is that despite the efforts by a new administration, and let's give this administration some credit, a brand new administration, despite the efforts to engage, despite the efforts by in standing up and supporting PAHO and COVAX and everything else, you have a region that for the longest time has been one that has been largely ignored. At least that's the feeling that most member states have. And as a result, when you look to the multilateral arena, it's hard to go to countries and engage in countries that you have not engaged with for a while, for a significant period of time, and try to lay on their lap a hemispheric issue or a global issue and have them basically look across at you and see you as, it's not about the administration, it's really about the United States, see you as this embedded friend, this embedded partner that is working with this region holistically, day in, day out, year in, year out. I think what the vaccine has highlighted is an opportunity, indeed, for the US to sort of step up its game. But it's not the only issue. Obviously, there's climate change and there are a bunch of other issues that are important to the region. So I think if the engagement is consistent, and if it's deep, and if it's abiding, and if it's recognizing that we're not all the same, there has to be a nuanced approach to each and every one of us. That's where the relationship gets stronger, and that's where we end up partnering more often on multilateral issues.
Thank you, Ambassador. I want to also foot stomp one of your points is that the Biden-Harris administration, we're only 6 months into the administration. And so you look at how much things, the progress in 6 months and so far as not only kind of vaccination here in the U.S., but then these series of announcements with regard to global shipments. There's also a question. I want to go to the next set, but Dr. Fitzgerald, there's a question in here from the Q&A from Edward Green, who's a former UN Special Envoy for HIV, who I'm sure you know well, and he asked an important question about the other players and the geopolitical equation. He asks about Russia and the Sputnik vaccine. That's he mentions here found to be of dubious impact, having not yet received WHO approval. He mentions there's the time to viability of the Cuba vaccine. And he had a question of if PAHO has a view on the vaccine hesitancy, especially with regard to the Russian vaccine and what is forthcoming from the Cuban front.
Yeah, so it's good. Always good to hear from Dr. Green. So on the issue of vaccines, you know that when we are supporting vaccine availability through either a COVAX mechanism or through the PAHO revolving fund, we apply strict requirements and criteria in terms of quality, safety, and efficacy. In this case, emergency use licensing through the WHO, also pre-qualification processes. And this allows us to have that level of certainty with regard to efficacy and safety for vaccines. And we will continue to do that. I think it's very important that countries continue to look at the necessary regulatory processes that they have in place to ensure the necessary standards, international standards are being met. With regard to this, then implications for the Caribbean, we're working very closely with the Caribbean regulatory system through processes of reliance to decide how they can best ensure the quality, safety, and efficacy of the vaccines based on decisions that third-party regulatory authorities are going to be taking. And this is really important then, as Dr. Green has noted, in terms of providing the necessary confidence to populations in terms of vaccine hesitancy. If the population does have the necessary confidence and trust in the quality, safety, and efficacy, well then maybe that will also contribute to reducing the level of vaccine hesitancy across the nations of the Caribbean.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to, we have 2 more minutes. I want to end with, I'll go with Ambassador Brewster, then Ambassador Edmonds, give you the last word here. But Ambassador Brewster, what happens if the Caribbean doesn't get a significant ramp up in vaccines? I'll give you 60 seconds to answer that, and then I'll go to you, Ambassador Edmonds, for the final thought.
Absolutely. I think it's going to be similar to what happens in the United States if we didn't ramp it up quickly, and that is we're going to see an increase in deaths, a stress on the health system, a stress on the economic stability of the countries, increase and rise in bad actors that will take advantage of these situations, and we will have a lot of instability, as Ambassador Edmonds mentioned, and I think it will have a huge impact on not just the Florida economy, but also other economies like New York, where there's large diaspora. It will have a long-term effect on our issues. And I think it's important to mention that, as was mentioned before, the Biden administration came in a very precarious situation and has only had a few months to be able to address this situation. I'm very proud of what they've done. Now, I will say we have an incredible Health and Human Services Department that is working minute by minute to try to help the Western Hemisphere, as well as CDC and others. So we have a lot of people that are working very, very hard on it. And I think that we'll get it resolved. So hopefully, Jason, to answer that question, we won't have to know what that answer is, because we will get it resolved quickly.
Thank you. And Ambassador, I've been same question to you, but also if you could give one piece of advice, or what participants who are joining us today for this discussion, whether via Zoom or through other platforms, what's the last thing that you want them to walk away with insofar as actions that can be taken to elevate this issue?
Well, look, first of all, I think I just want to touch on one element. I think the countries in the region have done yeoman's work in terms of setting up protocols to protect their populations as well as visitors, and that's oftentimes overlooked. I believe that countries in the region are going to get vaccines. The question is where they're going to get them from, and the question is whether the United States is going to be the partner who is going to be leading that effort. My hope, my advocacy for anybody listening is to sort of help us raise that voice so that we can basically make ourselves heard and get access, so we can stabilize our economies. At the end of the day, we can address all of the economic problems that are manifesting themselves, and we end up with a stable region, stable democratic region as we've traditionally been. So advocacy is what I think we're looking for, support. And from the administration, we're looking for a partner who recognizes that we are looking to them for some support and some guidance, but we need it now. We don't need it next year, next month. I understand there's supply chains issues and everything else, but we really and truly are looking to the US to step up today versus later.
Oh, thank you, Ambassador Edmonds, for those final comments. I want to thank you, Ambassador Edmonds, Ambassador Brewster, congratulate you and Wasimo on the issue brief, Dr. Fitzgerald, as well as our board member, Melanie Chen, for all participating in today's discussion. This is part of a broader body of work of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center and elevating the importance of vaccinations for the region, and also looking at post-COVID prosperity and economic reactivation across the region. And of course, within our Caribbean initiative, vaccinations for the Caribbean, and then also what does that mean insofar as economic reactivation? How can we help to facilitate that economic reactivation of the Caribbean? For those who don't receive our weekly COVID aviso, please sign up for that on our website. It comes out every Thursday. It gives a digest of all the news with regard to COVID across the region. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining today's discussion, and look forward to seeing you the next time.